He betrayed her in the worst way while she was in surgery. Some people say that time heals everything. I don't believe that. Not when you've seen the kind of betrayal that leaves a permanent mark. Not when you've held your sister's hand while she wept over something that should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. And definitely not when the person who hurt her walked away without a scratch on his conscience. This story isn't just mine. It's my sister's too. We both carry the memory of what happened that day, though in very different ways. She was the one in the hospital bed, barely conscious, recovering from not one, but 2 surgeries. I was the little sister sitting in a cold waiting room, furious that I couldn't be by her side, helpless to stop what was unfolding behind closed doors. We were both powerless, but I never forgot what he did to her. And years later, when fate gave me the chance to do something about it, I didn't hesitate. Let me give you some context. My sister, who I'll call Sara for this story, is 8 years older than me. When I was 14, she was 22 and pregnant with her first child. She had been with her boyfriend Paul for 4 years by then. They were engaged, and for a while they seemed happy. But that didn't last. Her pregnancy was absolutely brutal. I'm talking about severe nausea, constant pain, gestational diabetes, and back issues so bad she could barely stand by her 3rd trimester. It was heartbreaking to watch her go through it. Instead of being supportive, Paul became colder as time went on. He started snapping at her for complaining, acting like her suffering was just exaggeration. I remember overhearing him say something like, "Your body was made for this. It can't be that bad." That sentence stuck with me. I didn't fully understand pregnancy at the time, but I knew that wasn't how a decent partner was supposed to speak. Sara also had this very specific fear about her due date. She was due around Valentine's Day and begged the universe to let her baby come early or late, just not on the holiday. She didn't want her child to share a birthday with something that would overshadow it. Her own birthday sometimes fell on Easter, and she hated it. She didn't want that for her son. Unfortunately, Paul's parents thought it was adorable. They even suggested she name the baby Valentine or Valentino if he was born on that day. Sara hated the idea. She thought it was tacky, and knew kids would make fun of him. Paul, to his credit, initially agreed with her. They even picked out more traditional names together, or so we thought. Fast forward to February. Sara had been put on bed rest because her blood pressure would spike and drop unpredictably if she moved too much. Her back pain was getting worse. She looked exhausted all the time. I remember watching her lie on the couch, her hands on her belly, trying not to cry. She kept saying she just wanted to get it over with. When the big day came, I sat in the waiting room with my dad and brothers. Paul was there too, but he refused to go into the delivery room. He said it was gross. Meanwhile, I wasn't allowed in because I was too young. I remember how angry that made me. The man who was supposed to be there for her didn't care enough to be by her side, and I, her sister, would have done anything to hold her hand, but I wasn't allowed. Eventually, my dad took the younger boys home, but my oldest brother Zeke stayed with me. We were both too anxious to leave. 16 hours after Sara went into labor, my nephew was born. It was evening, and yes, it was Valentine's Day. We all hoped things would start to get better from there, but they didn't. Not even close. Sara didn't just have a rough delivery. She had an emergency cesarean section, and during that procedure, the doctors discovered something terrifying. A massive tumor on the back of her uterus. Thankfully, it wasn't cancerous, but it was dangerously large. So large that they immediately prepped her for another surgery. They had to remove the tumor. And while doing so, they had no choice but to perform a full hysterectomy. Just like that, Sara lost the ability to ever have children again. That baby boy would be her one and only. While she was unconscious in surgery, Paul was left to take care of everything related to the baby. He was the one filling out the paperwork. He was the one making decisions. He was the one writing down names. And that's where the betrayal begins. Growing up, Sara was always the responsible one. She was the kind of older sister who took on a second mother role without even realizing it. She helped with homework, packed lunches when our parents were swamped, and always had time for me, no matter how tired she was. I looked up to her in every possible way. So when she started dating Paul, I thought it was just the next chapter of her perfect life. He seemed charming. He had this polite, clean-cut look and said all the right things. For the first few years, I think he actually treated her well. They had been together for 4 years when Sara found out she was pregnant. She was nervous but excited, and Paul seemed just as thrilled. They got engaged a few weeks after the news. I remember the little celebration our family threw. It was small but heartfelt. My parents were proud, and Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, were ecstatic. His mom cried when she heard it might be a boy. Everything felt like it was falling into place for them. But life has a way of revealing people under pressure. And pregnancy, especially a difficult one, is pressure like no other. Sara's pregnancy turned into a nightmare pretty early on. Around the 4th month, she started showing signs of hyperemesis. At first, she thought it was just bad morning sickness, but it never stopped. She couldn't hold down food or water. She was constantly dizzy, in pain, and losing weight. She looked pale and hollow, but she kept trying to smile through it. Then came the diagnosis of gestational diabetes, which meant even more dietary restrictions and monitoring. Her blood sugar was all over the place. And as if that weren't enough, she developed intense back pain that left her barely able to stand. We didn't know it at the time, but that pain was a warning sign, a red flag waving in plain sight. It wasn't just the normal discomfort of pregnancy. It was something far worse growing inside her. But none of us, not even the doctors, could see it yet. While all of this was happening, Paul began to change. At first, it was subtle. A few sighs when she'd ask for help getting out of bed, a little eye roll when she said she was in pain. Then came the comments, "You're overreacting. Your body's supposed to handle this. It can't be that bad." It wasn't just ignorance, it was dismissiveness he didn't care to understand. He didn't want to. Sara confided in me a lot during that time. I might have only been 14, but I listened. And I could see the fear in her eyes when she talked about how Paul was pulling away. She was doing everything she could to stay calm, stay optimistic, and keep things from falling apart. She still wanted to believe they would get through it. That once the baby came, everything would go back to normal. One thing that really stood out during this time was the battle over the baby's name. Sara has always been a little sensitive about birthdays. Hers sometimes landed on Easter, and she hated having her special day overshadowed by a holiday. So when she realized her due date was dangerously close to Valentine's Day, she panicked a little. She joked about doing jumping jacks to make the baby come early. Anything to avoid that holiday. Paul didn't seem to care. And his mother, Mrs. Doe, actually seemed thrilled about the idea. I remember her saying, "You could name him Valentine or Valentino. That would make the day even more special." She said it with a big grin, like she had just solved the biggest problem in the world. Sara's face immediately fell. She was completely against it. She thought the name sounded cheesy, like something from a bad romance novel. She imagined her son getting teased for it at school and hated the idea of tying his identity to a holiday. It felt fake to her. To be fair, Paul initially agreed. He told Sara they'd go with something more traditional, Daniel or Jared, something simple and strong. That made her feel better, at least for a while. But now, looking back, I think he only told her that to shut her up. He never actually gave up on the Valentino idea. And worse, his parents loved it. It was like they were all waiting for the perfect moment to get their way, a moment when Sara wouldn't be able to say no. As the pregnancy dragged on, Sara was eventually put on full bed rest. Her blood pressure started doing weird things, spiking for no reason or dropping suddenly when she tried to stand. She was in constant pain, barely eating, and so tired. I would sit next to her bed and read to her sometimes. She used to close her eyes and just listen, not because she wanted to sleep, but because it helped her forget how miserable she felt. Paul wasn't around much by then. He always had an excuse. Work, errands, things that mysteriously took hours longer than they should have. When he was home, he hovered near the door or stayed in the next room glued to his phone. My parents noticed. Zeke definitely noticed. And Sara, bless her, still kept defending him. She kept saying he was just overwhelmed, that maybe he didn't know how to handle everything. She still hoped he would step up when it counted. We all did. None of us knew just how wrong we were. The day Sara went into labor felt like the longest day of my life. She had started feeling contractions early in the morning, and by noon, my entire family was in motion. My mom packed bags, my dad gathered the younger kids, and I stayed glued to Sara's side. Paul was already driving her to the hospital by the time I even got dressed. Zeke and I ended up riding in a separate car with our dad. I'll never forget the tension in the air. We all knew things weren't going to be easy. Sara was already drained physically and emotionally. Her body had been pushed to its limits for months, and now it was time for the final act. But even with all the complications, even with all the fear, she was determined to deliver her baby. When we got to the hospital, things started moving quickly. Sara was admitted, monitored, and prepped. The medical team was kind, but serious. They could tell this wasn't a normal delivery. Her vitals were unstable. Her pain was spiking, but she was trying to hold it together. I saw her grip Paul's hand once. He held it for about 5 seconds before pulling away to scroll through his phone. Eventually, the hospital staff told us only certain people could be in the room during delivery. I was too young. Zeke, despite being older, wasn't allowed either. Only one person was allowed in with her. And Paul? Of course it was. Paul refused. "She's being dramatic," he said. "I don't need to see all that blood and screaming." My mom was furious. She offered to go in instead, but the staff had already started prepping, and Paul was listed as the designated partner. He was supposed to be there, but he just sat down in the waiting room, pulled out his earbuds, and opened a bag of chips. Remember sitting next to him, watching him scroll through social media while my sister was giving birth just down the hall? I was only 14, but even I knew that something was horribly wrong with this picture. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. And Sara had no idea. My dad eventually took our 2 youngest brothers home, but Zeke and I stayed behind. We refused to leave. Hours passed. 6, then 10, then 12. Sara's labor was not progressing normally. Her blood pressure was all over the place. The baby's heart rate kept dipping. I remember nurses rushing in and out of her room, doctors whispering with concerned expressions, and Paul still sitting there like it was all some minor inconvenience. After 16 exhausting hours, the doctors decided it was too dangerous to wait any longer. Sara had to be taken in for an emergency cesarean section. I wasn't told that part until later. I just saw the medical team rushing around, prepping equipment, wheeling her past the waiting room with a pale, tense expression on her face. My mom followed behind the gurney with tears in her eyes. It felt like forever. Zeke and I sat there in silence. We didn't know what to say. Nobody told us anything. Paul finally looked up from his phone and started pacing, but he didn't look worried. He looked irritated, like he was missing something more important than the birth of his child. When the baby was finally born, the nurses told us it was a boy, healthy, 7 pounds, and born right on the evening of Valentine's Day. I looked over at Paul, waiting for a reaction, a smile, relief, something. He just nodded and said, "Cool." Sara didn't get to see him. She didn't get to hold him. Because while everyone was celebrating, the doctors made a discovery that changed everything. During the C-section, they found a massive tumor growing on the backside of her uterus, the side closest to her spine. It was large, twice the size of a normal uterus. It had been growing silently for months, hiding behind the baby during every ultrasound. The tumor explained everything: her unbearable back pain, her blood pressure issues, her fatigue. The doctors made a quick decision. The tumor had to come out immediately. They couldn't wait. So Sara, without even waking up to see her newborn son, was wheeled into a second emergency surgery. This time, the outcome was even more devastating. In order to remove the tumor safely, they had to perform a full hysterectomy. That meant her uterus was completely removed. Sara, at just 22 years old, would never be able to carry another child. This baby, her baby boy, would be her one and only. My mom came out to tell us hours later. She looked exhausted, drained, and heartbroken. She didn't cry, but her voice cracked when she said the words. Zeke put a hand on my shoulder, and we both sat there in stunned silence. I felt numb. I didn't even know what to feel. Anger, sadness, fear. Sara was still unconscious in recovery. Paul, meanwhile, had suddenly decided to play the part of the concerned father. He started asking questions, pacing with a furrowed brow, pretending to be involved. But when Zeke went to check on him, he found Paul doing something strange. Paul was in the hospital's administrative area, filling out paperwork, alone, calm, like nothing had happened. He was filling out the birth certificate, and he wasn't waiting for Sara. Zeke found Paul sitting at a desk with a pen in his hand and a hospital administrator standing nearby. In front of him was the stack of official birth documents, paperwork that required both parents' signatures, paperwork that Sara had specifically asked to be involved in, but Paul was signing it alone. Zeke asked him, "Shouldn't you wait for Sara?" Paul looked up and smiled like he was doing her a favor. "She's been through enough," he said. "She needs to rest. I've got this handled." And with that, he went right back to writing. Zeke didn't push it. At 16 years old, he didn't know what to make of the situation. He didn't understand how serious this was. At the time, he thought maybe Paul was just trying to help, so he let it go. None of us knew then that Paul had already made a choice. He was going to name the baby Valentino. He did it calmly, quietly, without even blinking. He wrote it in neat block letters on the birth certificate. He listed Sara as the mother and then forged her signature. Just like that. As if her opinion had never mattered. And to make it airtight, Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, showed up, just in time to act as witnesses. They signed off saying they had seen Sara agree to the name, which was a complete lie. They hadn't arrived until after the second surgery had already started, but they vouched for their son without hesitation. When Sara woke up, she was groggy, confused, and in pain. She asked for her baby. My mom was there. She tried to keep her calm, told her everything was okay, that the baby was healthy, but Sara could tell something was off. She kept asking where Paul was, why no one would hand her any papers to sign, why everyone kept dodging her questions. She didn't learn the truth until the next morning. That's when the nurse brought in the official hospital copy of the birth certificate for final review. The name Valentino was printed in black ink at the top. I wasn't in the room, but I heard my mom tell the story later. Sara stared at the paper in silence for a full minute. Her face didn't move. Her hands stayed still. Then she looked up at the nurse and asked very quietly, "Why does it say Valentino?" The nurse blinked. "That's what your husband put down yesterday. And your signature is here too." Sara looked at the signature. Her mouth opened like she was going to say something, but nothing came out. She just shook her head. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "That's not his name." When Paul came back to the hospital that day, she didn't speak to him. Not at first. She held her son in her arms, looked down at his tiny face, and tried to feel the joy that should have been there. But all she could feel was betrayal. When she finally did speak, it was only to say 5 words. "I want that name changed." Paul tried to act surprised. He said she had agreed before the surgery, that she had mentioned the name to him weeks earlier, that it had slipped out of her mouth in a moment of weakness, and he had just gone with it. He swore he thought she wanted it. He even blamed her memory, saying the anesthesia might have messed with her head, but she wasn't buying it. She told him she never said yes, she never signed anything, and she certainly didn't want her only child named after a holiday she despised. Paul got defensive. He started raising his voice, said the name was already official, that it was too late to undo it, that she was overreacting. Sara just nodded, and then she told him to leave. He tried to argue, but she didn't budge. My mom backed her up. The hospital staff stepped in. Paul left that day, and Sara didn't see him again for weeks. Over the next month, she fought to have the name changed. She went through legal paperwork, consulted a lawyer, provided medical proof that she was under anesthesia when the original certificate was filed. Eventually, the hospital backed down. The name was officially corrected to one of the names they had actually agreed on together before the birth. It was a victory, a small one, but it mattered. The bigger issue, though, was trust. Sara had been planning on co-parenting. She still believed her son deserved to know his father. But after that betrayal, everything changed. She told Paul he could have visitation if he wanted, but it would be supervised until further notice. He didn't even argue. He just stopped showing up. For weeks, then months, then longer. No phone calls, no visits, no birthday cards, nothing. It was like he disappeared, and we were all left wondering how a man could vanish so easily from his own child's life, especially after making such a loud, selfish decision about his name. The answer didn't come until later. And when it did, it revealed the second betrayal, the one that had been happening all along. After the name was legally changed and Paul disappeared from the picture, things quieted down for a while. Not in an easy, peaceful way. More like the eerie stillness that follows a storm. Sara was left picking up the pieces, physically recovering from 2 major surgeries, emotionally trying to come to terms with everything that had happened, and mentally adjusting to life as a single mother. She never got the postpartum joy that some new mothers talk about. Her body was healing slowly, and there was grief beneath the surface. Not just grief for the relationship she thought she had, or the future she believed she was building with Paul, but also the quiet, crushing grief of knowing that she would never carry another child. She didn't talk about that much, not even with me, but I could see it. In the way she looked at baby clothes she knew she'd never reuse. In the way she would smile when someone said, "Maybe for your next one," and then fall silent a moment later. Still, she showed up for her son. Every single day. She named him something strong and classic, something she loved, and poured everything she had into giving him the best life possible. She woke up for every feeding, handled every diaper change, and juggled all of it while still attending doctor appointments for her own recovery. She never asked for help unless she absolutely had to. For a while, she kept hoping Paul would come around, that maybe once the dust settled, he'd reach out and ask to be involved, that he'd want to meet his son. She never loved him again. Not after what he did, but she still believed that her child deserved a relationship with his father. And she wanted to be fair, even if he hadn't been. But Paul never came back. At first, it was just silence. No calls, no messages, no word from him or his family. Then came the legal notice that he was refusing custody, but wouldn't fight the child support claim. The payments were minimal and inconsistent, but he didn't fight them. It was like he had written them both off, like none of it mattered. And then came the real twist. It had been 6 months since Sara gave birth when one of our mutual friends tagged someone in a Facebook photo. I clicked the notification out of habit, not expecting anything important. What I saw made my jaw drop. It was a wedding photo. Paul's wedding photo. There he was, dressed in a gray suit, standing next to a smiling woman in a white dress, holding hands in front of an altar. The caption said something cheesy, like, "Finally, married my best friend," with hearts and hashtags. Her name was Jane. I didn't know whether to laugh, scream, or throw my phone. I showed the photo to Sara. She stared at it for a long time. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen, and made herself a cup of tea without saying a word. She didn't cry. I think she had cried so much in the months before that there was nothing left. We found out pretty quickly that Paul had started dating Jane while Sara was still pregnant, maybe even before she knew she was expecting. The timeline was sketchy, but the overlap was obvious. He had been cheating. All those nights when he was too busy to be home. All those errands that took suspiciously long. He was with her. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was abandonment. And the worst part? Jane had no idea. As far as we could tell, she didn't even know Sara existed. Didn't know there was a child. Didn't know that her shiny new husband had forged a signature on a legal document while the mother of his child was unconscious in surgery. It was like he had taken an eraser to his past and wiped it clean. Sara could have made a scene. She could have messaged Jane, could have posted the receipts, but she didn't. That's not her style. She believed in handling things through the proper channels, so she quietly filed for full custody, documented everything, and let the court system do its job. The child support payments continued sporadically. Paul never responded to any legal communication directly. He used a lawyer and kept his distance. Jane never showed up to any hearings or meetings, which made sense if she didn't know anything about it. And so, life moved on. Sara became a force of nature. She got a part-time job once she had healed enough. She started attending parenting groups. She built a routine. She smiled more. She laughed again. She created a peaceful home for her son, and slowly the wounds began to scar over. But I never forgot. Because where Sara saw closure, I saw unfinished business. I was still angry. Not just for what Paul did to my sister, but for how easily he walked away. For how casually he hurt someone and then moved on like it had never happened. And I knew one thing for sure. If I ever got the chance to remind him of what he did, to make him remember, then I would take it, without hesitation. It had been 6 years since everything happened. Sara's son was in kindergarten by then, a happy and curious little boy who loved dinosaurs and bedtime stories. He had his mother's eyes and her quiet strength. She never spoke Paul's name around him. He only knew his dad through vague references, and he never asked many questions. He didn't seem to miss what he had never known. As for me, I had just finished beauty school and landed my first real job as a hairdresser at a local Great Clips. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. I liked making people feel good about themselves. I liked the conversations. And most of all, I liked the feeling of building something with my own 2 hands. It felt like control in a world that didn't always offer much. One afternoon, I was folding towels behind the front desk when my manager handed me the next client ticket. I looked up and called the name. Jane, and there she was. I didn't recognize her at first, but then she stepped forward, placed her bag on the counter, and smiled politely. She looked a little tired, very pregnant, and completely unaware of who I was. My stomach dropped. I read her last name on the appointment system just to be sure. And yes, it was her. Paul's wife. The woman he had married right after vanishing from my sister's life. The woman he had probably been cheating with all along. It took me a moment to process it. She didn't know me. She had never met me. I was just the stylist who happened to be working that day. And I decided right then that I wasn't going to blow up. I wasn't going to confront her or cause a scene. Because now I saw it clearly. This was my moment. I took her back to my station and asked her how she wanted her hair done. She said just a trim. Something easy. We chatted casually at first, the way you do in a salon. I told her how far along. She looked and she laughed and said, just about 10 weeks to go. She touched her stomach and looked genuinely excited. She talked about the pregnancy, said it had been harder than she expected. Paul wasn't exactly the world's most supportive partner. That got my attention. I kept my tone neutral and asked, is this your first? She nodded. Yep, our first. I almost choked on my gum. She didn't know. She had no idea about Sara. No idea about the son he had abandoned. No clue that the man she was building a family with had already walked out on one. I kept the conversation moving, careful not to let anything slip. She started venting about how hard it was to pick a name. Paul had suggested a bunch already, and she didn't like any of them. She said he kept bringing up weird, dramatic names, and she wanted something beautiful but simple. Unique but not ridiculous. I don't want her to sound like she was named by Instagram, she said with a tired laugh. That's when the idea hit me. A quiet, perfect idea. I smiled and said, well, I heard a name recently that I thought was really beautiful. It's simple, elegant, and not too common. She perked up. Yeah? What is it? Sara, I said, spelled the traditional way. I've always thought it was so classic. She paused, thought about it, then smiled. I love that. Sara. It's really pretty. And just like that, it was done. I finished her haircut, made polite conversation, and sent her on her way. She thanked me and even left a tip. I didn't say anything else. Didn't hint at the connection. I just waited. A few months later, I checked her Facebook. There was a post announcing the birth of her daughter. A picture of a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Welcome to the world, Sara. Apparently, she had insisted on the name. Paul had pushed for other options, but Jane stood her ground. She loved the name and wasn't changing her mind. I sat back in my chair and laughed. Because now, every time Paul looks at his daughter, he hears my sister's name. The one he betrayed. The one he walked away from. The one he thought he had erased. Sometimes revenge doesn't come in the form of fireworks. It doesn't have to be loud or messy. Sometimes the sweetest kind of revenge is the one served in silence. The one where they never even realize what hit them. And that's exactly what this was. Paul had no idea I was the one behind the name. He had no clue the woman giving his wife a haircut that day was the same little sister of the woman he abandoned. And he would never know that the reason his daughter shares a name with the woman he betrayed was because I put it there, softly. Without ever raising my voice, it was perfect. Not because it hurt him in some dramatic public way, but because it was personal. It was quiet. It was something he would have to live with every day, and probably never connect the dots. His daughter's name is Sara. Every time he says it, writes, it, hears it on a playground or during a school roll call, he is repeating the name of the woman whose heart he broke, the woman he lied to, cheated on, and discarded like she never mattered, the woman who gave birth to his son while he was already planning a new life with someone else. And speaking of that son, he's 10 years old now. Smart, funny, a little shy in crowds, but fearless when he's with people he loves. We call him by his real name now, but sometimes just in the family we still call him Val. It's become a joke between us. Sara pretends to hate it, rolling her eyes and groaning dramatically, but we all know she doesn't mind. Not really, not anymore, because she got to choose who he is. She took back that choice, and with it, a little piece of her power. And she's not alone anymore either. She's been seeing someone for the past year, a kind, steady man who treats her and her son with the love and respect they always deserved. He's been more of a father to that little boy in 1 year than Paul ever managed in his entire life. And honestly, I think the kid knows it. You can see it in the way he looks up to him. It's not the blood that makes a dad. It's the consistency, the love, the presence. As for Jane, I still wonder sometimes what she knows now. If she ever found out. If Paul eventually told her the truth, or if she's still living in the carefully curated version of reality he created. Maybe she figured it out on her own. Maybe she found the old paperwork, the court records, the child support statements. Who knows? But I don't feel bad for her. Not really. Because whether she knows it or not, she's now tied to the very woman her husband tried to erase. Their daughter carries the name of the woman who endured the worst kind of betrayal and came out stronger on the other side. And Paul, well, he gets to live in that shadow every single day. It's not the kind of revenge people make movies about. There was no screaming, no dramatic showdown, no public takedown, but it was real. And it mattered. Because in a world where my sister's voice was stolen during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life, I found a way to give a little piece of it back. That's what family does. We remember, we wait, and when the time is right, we act, quietly, carefully, and with absolute precision.
The case has been heard. The stories have been told. Now it's your turn to judge. Leave your verdict in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe. The Court of Stories is always in session.